Sure. Okay, thank you, Melissa. Just because I'm running Zoom from the web client, it means I can't drive the slides myself. So Melissa has kindly offered to do so. Yeah, hi, I'm Jonathan Hunt, and I'm going to talk to you today about Archive Central. Next slide. So as far as we know, Archive Central is probably maybe around the 5th new Islandora 8 that's gone public. It's for a consortium of 9 councils in the centre of the North Island of New Zealand, and they run a collaborative archiving operation, including a physical facility where they keep physical records, a lot of photos, documents, plans, etc. One of the interesting things about this particular project is that because of the timing, we found that we could adopt the records in context conceptual model from the International Council of Archives. So it's a relatively new archival standard that intends to integrate many of the existing archival standards like ISAG and CPF and so forth, but bring archiving into the linked data world. We were migrating from a system called Kete, which I'll talk about in a moment, and we had to migrate records, still images and documents from Kete, and also trackable items which we mapped to containers and locations. Next slide, please. So just very quickly, I work for Catalyst. We are an open source technology services company primarily based in New Zealand, but we also have offices throughout Australia, also Brighton and Dublin, and I believe we've just opened an office in Canada, which I will find out more about, so I can tell you more about that one. Next slide. So this is an example of Kete. It was based on Ruby on Rails, and it was built from the ground up to be a community archive. And it was launched around 10 years ago. It had a bit of take up in New Zealand, not much outside New Zealand as far as I know, but it didn't really get the community support that it needed. So it was a bit of a dead end and people were looking to migrate off it. And you can see the example here, the theme is non-responsive. It didn't really showcase the material the way it deserves these days. Next slide. So we moved it to Islandora, Islandora 8 specifically, 8.1, with a Bootstrap 4 based theme. So it's fully responsive. This is an example of the same piece of content, and you can see that the content has a lot more room, and this is using the OpenSeaDragon image viewer. Later on, if you click the Octothorpe on the right, you'll go to that particular page on Archive Central. And as I mentioned before, we adopted the records and context data model, and we also added things like groups for access control, and a few other little tweaks as well. Next slide, please. Just a bit more on records and context. So the links there are to the conceptual model and to the ontology document. It's a relatively new standard, so it's version 0.2, and they're looking for feedback on that. To the best of my knowledge, this is probably one of the first production instances of records and contexts, because I think to date, the only examples that I've found have been demonstrations or prototypes. And we built, the data that we built is a blend of the default Islandora entities, a partial implementation of records and contexts, and some custom content types and fields. And amongst those we implemented were agents, so corporate body, family, and person. You'll recognize those as terms, place terms, and where you see the RIC-E22, for example, that's a direct mapping to the records and context entity 22 for place, for example. We added accessions, which aren't in records and contexts. We added record sets of type series, records as nodes, and also added custom containers and locations. And also around that were some extra entities like rights, which was licensing, newsletters, basic pages, the kind of things that Drupal does as a content management system. Next slide, please. So records and context, the mapping was done through the RDF YAML mapping files that you may be familiar with, both for nodes and terms, for the various content types, for the various bundles. I should remind you again that this mapping is only partial. It's not a complete implementation of records and contexts. So there's a bunch of entities in the standard that we are not using. Things like event and rule and mandate and position and various others. We simply didn't need those at this point in time. We've skipped over a few entities like group, so we've gone straight to family and corporate body, whereas the way the standard's implemented, there's I think maybe an abstract class called group that contains some common fields there. But the way that Drupal works anyway is if you have a field, you can share that between entities without necessarily needing a common class to inherit from. In Islandora, we've got dates directly as EDTF strings, not a class as they would be if it was a strict records and context implementation. And they are a class in records and contexts in order to attach things like annotations to the date. Relation in Islandora is from an instantiation or media to the record, and that's the relation RO25I, but that's the kind of reverse direction from the default relation in the standard. In our case in Islandora, the relations are not classes themselves, again, in order to carry annotations. So when was this relation established? The standard models those as classes, but we're not doing that at this point. We might use record part. That's an interesting one. It's an extra layer of hierarchy for, say, a multiple, basically what would have been a compound field in Islandora 7. So we may well use that moving forward, but we're not there yet. Next slide, please. And just if you are interested in the mapping, you can talk to me either afterwards, or you can visit any of the nodes, any of the record nodes on archivecentral.org.nz and put in the underscore format equals JSON-LD. This is just a little example, but you'll see that we have the mappings to the records and context ontology for a record, along with the existing mappings for schema.org, PCDM, DC terms, etc. So we just layered the Reco mappings on top of the existing predicates that Islandora is coming with. Next slide, please. And just a final slide around the data model. This is a screenshot of the edit form, and you'll just see that we annotated the labels for the fields, and in some cases expanded the field descriptions to give people guidance and to provide a direct reference to the upstream standard. So if there's any debate about what a field should have in it, you could use that reference and look at the standard, and hopefully that will guide the people doing data entry. Thanks, Melissa. So, next slide, location control. I just briefly mentioned that this is not in the records and context standards. So as well as accessions, location control for things like locations and containers are not part of the records and context standard. So this was slightly inspired by archive space, but modified as well, because the archive space handling of location control seemed fairly rigid to me. So we kind of used it as a basis, but we tried to make it a bit more Drupal-y. We have a container, which is something like a box or an envelope, and that might map to multiple records. And in turn, that has a location, which is a self-referential content type which could be first a row, then a shelf, then a room, and then a building. And in turn, those map to a particular place, which could be a street address. Next slide, please. So now the slide we're on is migration overview. So I've talked a bit about the data model, and this is now the migration to get there. So Kete was using a MySQL database, so that was our primary source for migration. We had to move about 210,000, just over, records. Most of those are simply records referencing a physical entity, but some of them had digital objects associated with them, including 7,000 images and 7,000 images and 600 PDF documents. And of course, we used the Drupal Migrate framework to do that. And along with database as a source for the migration, there's a few cases where it was easier just to have a CSV file, or in some cases embedded JSON, and I'll talk about that. Next slide, please. So the sequence of migration is something you'll need to think carefully about. In our case, obviously, we want to move users first. They're pretty foundational, and roles. We migrated Kete baskets, which was a way that it was doing access control into Drupal groups. Kete has a concept of notional, and that's basically equivalent of a basic page. So just any kind of ordinary content that's not particularly fielded or anything. We migrated licenses out of Kete into a few rights nodes. So we've modeled rights as a node entity. And we also migrated from embedded data, and that's how we basically snapshotted Creative Commons version 4 license and a bunch of rights statements from rightstatements.org. So I found it was just easier to capture the data from those as some embedded JSON and use the migration framework to pull those in. We migrated Kete agencies to agents, specifically corporate body terms, accessions to accession nodes, Kete series to records and context record set with a record set type of series. And then Kete items to record nodes. So we didn't use the default Islandora repository item. Instead, we split it into both record sets and record nodes. So they do share some fields, but then we could expand the fields to map to records and context. Then we migrated still images and documents, so that was the JPEGs and PDFs to Drupal files, and then the same sources to media, and of course they would join the node and the file. So in some cases it was the same data being referenced in approximately 3 different migrations in order to build that structure. And then we had trackable items in Kete, which is how they were doing shelf locations, and we mapped those to locations and containers. And that's a case where we actually used an intermediate field, intermediate table. So we did a migration from Kete to a kind of a holding table that was a bit closer to the data structures that we wanted, and then a second migration from that intermediate table into the final Drupal data structures. And that worked well, but it was one of those cases where there was too many things to change to do it in a single migration pass, so we ended up doing several passes. Next slide, please. Like any migration, there's always data challenges, and a migration is an opportunity to address data quality issues. So in some cases, we had some very long titles, up to 1,200 characters plus. So for those, we actually, and this is something we did for CanterburyStories.nz as well, we created a full title field, which was quite distinct from the default Drupal title or name field. And we could put the full title from the source into full title field, but leave the default title, which appears in your administration screens and your OAI PMH and a lot of other places, REST APIs, etc., as a somewhat more limited field. I think the default for Drupal is 256 characters. But we just find that those super long titles really blow out administration screens and forms and things, and they become quite awkward to work with. We also had some very disjoint values, which happens when you've got an archive, where multiple people over multiple years have been entering values, and generating some very interesting variations. So, for example, for the access control for a record, it was consult archivist, see archivist, refer to archivist, a whole bunch of other variations. In order to get visibility of those, we'd often pull the data out into OpenRefine, which I totally recommend, and then just run a simple text facet, and that would kind of tell us what kind of values we were confronted with. Another example of disjoint values was variations on capitalization, so things like EMFs and archives with different capitalization, and that's problematic. If you're trying to do a name match on an entity as part of the migration, then those would come up as distinct. We had numerous legacy IDs, and I actually tried building a typed identifier field module, but it just got really messy, especially when it came to mapping to either views or Solr. And in the end, we just modeled them all individually, which was a bit painful, but ultimately it seemed easier. And finally, with the modeling, unfortunately, Kete didn't really adhere to dry or do not repeat yourself, so it was somewhat denormalized. And also some fields were in questionable places. So things like coordinates were on a record, and I would say that a coordinate should really be on a place, and a record is associated with coordinates by virtue of its relationship to a place, and so on. Next slide, please. So just a few notes about the way we implemented things. Always sort your source rows because you really want to get that deterministic ordering coming in. We mapped those disjoint values either through a map processor in the migration YAML, or in many cases a prepare row hook in the module, in the migration module that we built, and there we could apply whatever arbitrary PHP logic we needed to tidy up the values. We also added a couple of event subscribers so that as each row came in, we could either create a redirect from the old URL path to a new URL path, or to assign a record or record set to a group. In some cases, we use composite keys for migrating rather than just a single ID. And for that intermediate table, one thing to note is if you are working with those, you might need to do something like an order by cast. So cast the identifier to a number, because by default, the migration mapping tables use varchar, which is a string. And if you sort by string, you'll get some interesting ordering if you're not aware of that. And there's this little snippet there of one of the migration YAMLs, and you'll see that we're flagging that we have redirects, we're batching it so that we can manage our memory better, and we're tracking changes so it won't migrate a entity unless it detects field values have changed. And next slide, please, the final slide. So if I've done this correctly, we have about a minute or two for questions. But thank you very much. I hope that was useful. There's a URL there, and I'll post that in the chat as well. So thank you everybody for listening, and I hope you really enjoy the rest of the day's presentations.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for joining us so very, very late at night and from tomorrow.
Yeah, it's about 1 a.m. here.
So if anyone has any questions, they can post into the chat. We have a couple of minutes here.
If you think of any questions later, my email's on that last slide. I've posted the link to the slides, and I'm often on the Slack, so you can always chase me up there.
All right. Oh, here is a question. You mentioned JPEGs being migrated to file and not media. Was that due to media not being in core at migration time?
Well, that was just me being strict about the JPEG itself gets mapped to a Drupal file, but then the JPEG still triggers a media entity being generated in Islandora, and it's the media that joins the file to the record node. So if you have a repository item and you add an image, you've got a media entity in between. So that's what I was trying to get across there. Our migration, I see Don asking, is our migration code on GitHub? It's not. I could probably share some of it. I don't know how much it will mean to people. And there really isn't that much custom. There's a little bit, but probably we've done some other migration work around CSVs, and there's probably a little bit more intelligence in those things, because this was quite custom to Kete, and I don't know how many people will be coming from Kete. But our CSV stuff, we're using things like pipe characters to separate multiple value fields within a CSV. And I know that things like the linked agents, there's a bit of logic in that one, which people might be interested in.